Money has a way of revealing truths that speeches and press conferences never quite capture. In politics especially, the path that money takes, where it begins, how it moves, who guides it, and who benefits from it, often exposes the real story beneath the headlines. And speaking as someone who has spent a lifetime watching capital flow through markets, through corporations, and through human behavior, I can tell you something with certainty. The origin of the money almost always tells you more than the amount itself. Right now, there is a narrative unfolding in American public life that has very little to do with campaign slogans or rally stages, despite the noise surrounding them. It's not about the chants, the hashtags, the viral clips, or even the debates. What's happening is deeper, quieter in some ways, but more consequential in others. It's a story about influence that doesn't announce itself, about donors who operate without spotlights, and about legal battles being propped up by financial structures far more complex than the average citizen realizes. People tend to imagine political donations in very simple terms. A supporter writes a check, it gets disclosed in a public filing, journalists report on it, and voters can see exactly who gave what. That system still exists, but it's only a fraction of the picture now. The political finance landscape has grown into something much bigger, more layered, and significantly more opaque. Because over the last decade, dark money has surged in a way that dwarfs anything from previous generations. I don't use the word surge lightly. The volume hasn't just risen, it has accelerated exponentially. In the 2024 election cycle alone, nearly $2 billion came from organizations that do not fully disclose their donors. $2 billion, that number would have sounded absurd 20 years ago. Today, it's simply a line inside an increasingly complicated ledger. This money doesn't appear in the usual campaign committee filings. It doesn't get attached to a donor's name. It often flows through nonprofits classified under certain sections of the tax code groups, allowed to receive unlimited contributions without revealing who wrote the check. It's a structure built for anonymity, and it accomplishes exactly that. Here's how the mechanism works. A wealthy individual, corporation, or interest group contributes to a nonprofit whose donor list is shielded from public view. That nonprofit then spends money on political messaging, ads, outreach campaigns, legal efforts, research projects, or funnels it into other organizations that do the same. By the time the funds reach their final destination, the original fingerprints are gone. It is political influence without political visibility. This raises fundamental questions about transparency. If voters cannot trace the financial motivations behind the messages they're receiving, how can they meaningfully evaluate what's being presented to them? If a candidate is being supported by millions of unseen dollars, where does their true accountability lie? With the voters or with the hidden financiers who are bankrolling the machinery that keeps them afloat? These questions become even sharper when we examine the legal and political ecosystem surrounding Donald Trump. To be clear, Trump is not the only figure operating within this environment. Dark money has permeated both sides of the political spectrum. But the way these structures intersect with his legal and financial world that deserves attention. Trump's political orbit relies heavily on PACs, particularly Save America PAC and MAGA Incorporated. On the surface, PACs are nothing new. They raise money, run ads, mobilize supporters. But in Trump's case, these PACs have taken on an additional role, one that sits at the center of this unfolding story. They have become a financial engine for his legal defense, paying for attorneys, filings, appeals, consultations, and an ever-growing list of cases that stretch far beyond traditional campaign disputes. Campaign funds are legally restricted. You can't simply use contributions to pay for unrelated lawsuits or personal legal troubles. But PACs, especially the kind of leadership PAC Trump controls, operate under looser rules. And those rules have been pushed into unfamiliar territory. During just the first 6 months of 2023, Save America reported spending over $21 million on legal fees. That's half a year, $21 million. I've seen numerous corporate legal battles in my life, and I can assure you that level of expenditure is staggering. And independent analyses suggest the true number spread across multiple entities over multiple years is significantly higher, tens of millions flowing into the defense of civil, criminal, and financial cases. The question that naturally follows is straightforward. Where is all that money coming from? Some of it comes from enthusiastic supporters, small dollar donors sending $20, $50, or $100 after receiving emails warning them that their candidate is being targeted unfairly. Many of these donors likely have no idea their contributions are going straight into legal warfare rather than political messaging. Others might know, or at least suspect, and choose to give anyway out of loyalty. But these grassroots contributions alone cannot sustain the sheer scale of spending, which leads us back to dark money, to donors who give quietly, beyond visibility, to entities built for concealment, to organizations whose financial movements can't be easily traced back to original sources, and to the real possibility that powerful interests, whether corporate or individual, are funding legal battles outside the public spotlight. From a structural standpoint, this resembles a type of financial instrument with layered ownership where the true stakeholders are hidden behind shells. In the business world, opacity like this would set off alarms. Investors want clarity. They want to know who's invested, where leverage sits, what obligations exist, and who ultimately controls the asset. Political finance should be no different. Yet here we are. Money passes through nonprofit A, which transfers funds to organization B, which sends money to PAC C, which pays law firm D. At the end of that chain, the public sees only one piece of the equation. That law firm D received a multi-million-dollar payment. Everything before that disappears into the fog. This structure isn't some accidental byproduct of a sloppy system. It's the result of deliberate design. Lawyers, political strategists, and financial architects have studied campaign finance law thoroughly and found every allowable passageway. What they've built is technically legal in most cases, though certainly not transparent and arguably not aligned with the spirit of democratic accountability. It's a system that transforms political donations into a kind of legal defense trust, one powered by donors who may not even know the full extent of what their contributions support. And all of this is occurring at a scale large enough to shape political survival, because there's a simple truth hiding inside all these numbers. You do not spend tens of millions on legal defense unless the legal pressure is enormous. This is not the behavior of someone fighting routine lawsuits. It is the pattern of someone facing a sprawling, multi-front legal confrontation that consumes time, attention, and critically money. Money that must come from somewhere, money that must continue flowing, and what happens if it stops? That is the question looming over the entire structure. Legal cases don't pause when donations slow. Courts don't reschedule trials because fundraising emails underperformed. Judges don't wait for PACs to reach their monthly goals. If the money dries up, the defense weakens, and if the defense weakens, the consequences grow. That vulnerability is the thread connecting everything we're discussing. The political apparatus supporting Trump depends on a continual supply of funds not only for campaign purposes but for legal survival. And when that survival is fueled partly by sources the public cannot see. It raises concerns, ethical, financial, democratic. This is where the real story sits. Not in rallies, not in slogans, not in sound bites, but in the subterranean world where influence is purchased quietly, where money moves without disclosure, and where legal defense becomes intertwined with political identity. What becomes clear as we follow the money deeper into this structure is that we're not simply observing the mechanics of campaign finance anymore. We're watching a hybrid machine, part political apparatus, part legal shield, part psychological engine, whose purpose stretches far beyond the boundaries of a traditional campaign. And this machine is powered by a stream of capital that does not always want to be seen, capital that moves through channels specifically designed to blur its origins. In the corporate world, when you assess a major investment or trace ownership across multiple subsidiaries, you begin by identifying the incentives behind each movement of money. Motivation is often easier to see than the movement itself, and that simple principle applies here as well. When tens of millions are being poured into legal defense through political intermediaries, someone somewhere has strong reasons for ensuring those outcomes. Money at this scale doesn't drift by accident. It is guided by intent, and intent becomes the central question: who benefits from keeping these legal battles funded and why? Part of the answer lies with the donor base Trump has cultivated over the years, a base that gives aggressively when they believe he is under attack. The fundraising spikes following indictments or court rulings aren't coincidences, they're engineered responses. The messaging campaign surrounding each legal event is immediate, coordinated, and emotionally calibrated. Emails go out warning supporters that their candidate is being persecuted. Texts frame the issue as a battle not just for one individual, but for the future of the movement itself. Social posts amplify outrage. The result is predictable: a flood of small dollar donations from people who feel personally connected to the struggle. For many of these donors, this isn't just politics, it's identity. Their contributions are acts of solidarity, expressions of belonging. They view the legal fights not as separate from the political mission, but as part of the same existential war. So when their money flows into legal expenses rather than ads or rallies, they may not see a contradiction. To them, defending their candidate is defending their cause. But small dollar donors, no matter how committed, cannot sustain the immense financial burn rate that these legal battles demand. Legal defense at this level is a high-pressure operation requiring a small army of elite attorneys, specialists, appeals, strategists, and crisis managers. Every deposition, every evidentiary hearing, every court filing adds to the cost. The scale quickly exceeds what grassroots funding can cover consistently. Which brings us back to the larger donors, the hidden ones, the ones behind the nonprofits, the sophisticated financial actors who understand how to wield influence without public attribution. Their role is both more subtle and more consequential. In any system where anonymity is possible, power tends to migrate toward those who can operate without scrutiny. And when political structures permit financial contributions to bypass public disclosure, it creates a natural opening for wealthy individuals or corporate interests who prefer to shape outcomes from the shadows. This is not speculation. It is a structural reality. And within that reality, one must ask, what kinds of interests would be motivated to underwrite legal defenses on such a massive scale? What do they stand to gain from keeping Trump politically viable or legally insulated? There are several possibilities, each of them credible. Some donors may see Trump as a political safeguard, someone who, if kept in the arena, will continue advancing policies that align with their financial or ideological interests. Others may view him as a destabilizing force whose presence benefits them indirectly by keeping political opponents distracted or weakened. Still, others may simply want access to regulatory decisions, access to influence, access to proximity. When political capital becomes intertwined with legal survival, donors acquire leverage, quiet leverage, influence that isn't declared but felt. Influence that exists in the gaps between what is spoken publicly and what is financed privately. This is one of the subtler dangers of opaque funding structures. Accountability shifts. Instead of being accountable primarily to voters, a politician becomes accountable to the financial ecosystem that sustains them. And when that ecosystem includes anonymous benefactors, the public has no way to know who holds the real power behind the scenes. Consider this from an investor's lens. If a company relied on dozens of undisclosed investors, each contributing substantial capital through a maze of intermediaries, would you feel confident evaluating that company's long-term stability? Probably not. You'd want to know exactly who those investors were, whether they had aligned interests, whether any of them posed reputational or regulatory risks. Now apply that same logic to a political figure whose legal survival depends on an opaque financing network. If you don't know who's funding the shield, you don't know who it serves. The opacity becomes more concerning when you look at the timeline. Across multiple legal cases spanning criminal indictments, civil fraud lawsuits, defamation actions, and investigations that reach back years, the funding has remained consistent. That consistency implies not just loyalty, but infrastructure. These aren't isolated donations, they are strategic injections. They suggest long-term planning and deep pockets. It is also worth noting that some of the PACs involved have altered their spending patterns over time, shifting more and more resources toward legal defense as the pressure mounted. This pivot isn't accidental. It's a sign of structural adaptation, a recognition that legal survival has become inseparable from political survival. Campaigns traditionally invest in growth, expanding outreach, hiring staff, building organizational capacity, but increasingly, the PACs associated with Trump are behaving like defense funds first, political engines second. Their financial priority is not electoral expansion, but legal containment. And this inversion of purpose has real consequences for American politics. Because when the financial machinery of a political movement reallocates itself around legal defense, it transforms the movement's internal dynamics. It reshapes how messages are crafted, how donors are solicited, how strategies are chosen. It also shifts the incentives. A candidate who relies heavily on legal defense funding has different priorities than one who relies primarily on campaign donations. Their vulnerability is different. Their obligations are different. Their relationship with donors becomes more entangled. They must keep the money flowing, not just to win votes, but to survive courtrooms. And survival-based fundraising tends to push messaging toward outrage, urgency, crisis. It cultivates a climate where fear, indignation, and grievance are more profitable than policy discussions or long-term planning. This is not unique to Trump. It is a structural feature of crisis-driven politics. But in his case, the volume, intensity, and stakes are amplified by the sheer number of legal fronts he is fighting. This environment creates yet another layer of complexity, the potential for donor fatigue. No donor base, large or small, can sustain infinite emergency appeals. Even loyal supporters have limits. Even wealthy backers calculate risk. And at the rate legal costs have grown, the funding demands will only intensify as cases progress toward trials, appeals, and potential sentencing, which raises a critical question. What happens when the financial load becomes too heavy for the political apparatus to carry? That possibility isn't theoretical. We've already seen signs of stress packs cutting back their activity, shifting money between entities, reducing contributions to other political candidates in order to prioritize legal expenses. These are all signals of financial triage, and triage is rarely a sign of strength. When a political movement's resources are diverted away from electoral operations toward legal protection, the long-term viability of the movement itself comes into question. You can't run a winning campaign indefinitely if your operating budget is consumed by legal defense. Something eventually gives, and the moment donors sense instability, the system becomes even more fragile, because donor confidence is a form of capital too, and once it erodes, it's difficult to rebuild. We're watching a structure held together by a constant feed of money, some visible, much of it hidden, shifting under the weight of increasing legal exposure. And the more money that flows through opaque channels, the harder it becomes for the public to understand the true balance of power shaping these events. This is the kind of opacity that corrodes democratic systems. Not because the money is necessarily illegal, not because the donors are necessarily malicious, but because democracy relies on transparency, and transparency cannot function when billions of dollars move in darkness. As long as the financial architecture surrounding Trump remains so deeply intertwined with undisclosed funding sources, and as long as those funds are used to protect not public interests but personal legal interests, the system will continue drifting further from accountability. This drift is gradual but unmistakable, and the longer it continues, the harder it becomes to correct. As we move deeper into this picture, the financial story and the political story begin to merge into something much larger, something that touches not only on one man's legal challenges or one campaign's funding structure, but on the resilience and limits of American institutions themselves. Because whether people realize it or not, what we're seeing is a test of how well the system can respond when massive private capital flows into political and legal arenas in ways the public cannot fully track. And tests like this don't happen in isolation. They occur against the backdrop of history, against patterns this country has lived through before, though never in this particular configuration. If you look back across American political scandals, you'll see that money has always played a role. Watergate involved secret donations laundered through committees. The Iran-Contra affair revolved partly around covert funding channels. Even during the progressive era, political machines used corporate money to influence legal outcomes and protect their power. But in each of those cases, the mechanisms were comparatively primitive, the sums substantially smaller, and the legal environment far less permissive. Today, the landscape is dramatically different. Technologies for rapid fundraising, legal structures for donor anonymity, and communication systems that mobilize supporters instantly, they've all evolved together. And when you combine these modern tools with a political figure facing dozens of simultaneous legal confrontations, you get something unprecedented, a perpetual crisis funding ecosystem. It behaves almost like a market. Supply, donor capital, responds to demand, political legal emergencies, and demand is continually refreshed by new legal developments. There is no endpoint, no equilibrium. The system sustains itself through urgency, outrage, and the constant need for additional legal resources. And like any market built on volatility, it begins to shape the behavior of the participants. Politicians adjust messaging to trigger fundraising surges. Legal teams expand or contract based on donor response. Media outlets, commentators, and influencers amplify each new legal drama because it energizes audiences and increases engagement. In effect, the legal crises become part of the product, an integral component of the overall political brand. This is one of the more sobering aspects of the entire structure, the incentives it creates. Political incentives are already notoriously misaligned with long-term stability, but when legal survival becomes interwoven with political fundraising, the misalignment becomes even sharper. Crisis becomes profitable, outrage becomes currency. The boundary between justice and politics blurs not because the cases lack merit, but because the financial ecosystem thrives on the perception of persecution. And when perception becomes profitable, incentives start pulling events in a specific direction. Take the fundraising appeals that accompany nearly every major court hearing or indictment. These messages are framed in existential terms. This is the moment. They're coming after us. Donate before midnight to defend our nation. For many donors, these are more than slogans. They are calls to arms, calls that convert emotion into money, calls that keep the legal machine funded. But this emotional financial feedback loop doesn't only affect donors, it affects the defendant too. Because when legal defense relies heavily on public outrage, there is little incentive to de-escalate or moderate. The financially optimal strategy becomes one of perpetual conflict. A calmer environment would reduce urgency and therefore reduce fundraising. Conflict becomes not just a legal reality, but a financial necessity. This is where the long-term consequences begin to emerge. A political figure who relies on crisis-driven fundraising is structurally incentivized to maintain a state of constant tension with institutions, courts, prosecutors, agencies, and even other branches of government. The narrative must remain dramatic, the stakes must remain high, the sense of siege must remain intact. That narrative keeps the money flowing. But institutions, unlike political movements, are not built to operate permanently under siege narratives. Courts rely on trust, public trust, that rulings are based on law, not politics. Prosecutors rely on credibility, faith that their actions are grounded in evidence, not partisan motives. Democratic systems rely on citizen confidence that the rules apply equally to everyone. When a political, legal fundraising structure conditions millions of people to believe that every indictment is an attack, every investigation is political, and every courtroom is biased, the legitimacy of those institutions erodes. Maybe not all at once, maybe not loudly, but erosion does not need drama. It happens grain by grain. And when erosion reaches a certain threshold, even truthful outcomes struggle to gain acceptance. This is one of the deeper risks embedded in the funding structure we are examining. It isn't simply about money. It's about what the money requires in order to keep flowing. Transparency becomes a threat. Accountability becomes negotiable. Legal outcomes become political events, and political messaging becomes a strategic tool for shaping public perception of the justice system. But while supporters are mobilized by emotion, and while political operatives leverage that emotion for funding, the legal system itself remains unmoved by sentiment. Court deadlines do not care about social media engagement. Discovery motions do not adjust for fundraising cycles. Judges do not alter trial dates because donors are energized or fatigued. The legal process moves at its own deliberate pace, absorbing the political noise but not bending to it. And this creates a structural collision. Political fundraising thrives on momentum, while the legal system operates slowly, methodically, and often quietly. For Trump, this mismatch has become a defining feature of his current reality. Fundraising appeals must create urgency even when legal timelines stretch for months. Donors are conditioned to expect high drama, but real legal battles often hinge on procedural details that unfold far from public view. The political machine must produce emotional peaks, while the legal machine produces monotony punctuated by occasional major rulings. Maintaining donor enthusiasm in this environment requires constant narrative escalation. Each legal setback must be framed as existential. Each courtroom appearance must be mythologized. Each ruling must be spun into a call for even greater loyalty. This escalation has its own risks. The more dramatic the messaging becomes, the more difficult it is to walk it back later. When the stakes have been described as all or nothing, supporters expect all or nothing outcomes. When leaders tell their base that defeat is unthinkable, any legal loss becomes psychologically destabilizing, and political movements that cannot absorb losses calmly become volatile. This volatility is not hypothetical. We have seen it before in moments of political polarization, during contested elections, during high-profile court decisions that triggered protests or unrest. Volatility emerges when expectations are inflated beyond what institutions can deliver. And in this case, the inflation of expectations is tied directly to the financial structure. The more money the system demands, the more intense the messaging becomes. The more intense the messaging becomes, the more public sentiment is shaped by fear and outrage rather than patience and understanding. Which brings us to another layer of complexity, the role of wealthy donors who operate behind opaque structures. Unlike small donors who give emotionally and impulsively, large donors tend to be strategic. They invest with purpose. Their contributions often serve long-term political, economic, or ideological goals. If they are contributing anonymously through dark money organizations that eventually funnel funds into PACs supporting legal defense, they are doing so with specific objectives in mind. And because their identities remain hidden, the public cannot evaluate whether these objectives are benign, self-serving, or potentially harmful. We cannot see whether these donors have business interests at stake in regulatory decisions. We cannot see whether they stand to benefit from favorable appointments, policy shifts, or legal outcomes. Without transparency, we cannot know whether the political figure they are supporting is being influenced in ways that conflict with the public interest. This shadow influence becomes even more concerning in the context of legal vulnerability. A politician fighting multiple legal battles is, by definition, in a weaker negotiating position. Support from wealthy benefactors becomes more valuable, and that value can translate into leverage. Leverage is power, and anonymous leverage is the most dangerous kind, because power exercised in the open can be scrutinized, debated, resisted. Power exercised in darkness cannot. This model legal vulnerability plus opaque funding plus political mobilization is not sustainable indefinitely. It can generate enormous short-term momentum, but over time it strains the system. The legal process continues unimpeded, siphoning more resources. Donors grow weary or cautious. The narrative escalates to unhealthy levels. Institutions experience stress. And the gap between public perception and legal reality widens. When that gap becomes too wide, political instability follows. We have already seen indicators increasing distrust of courts, growing belief that prosecutions are purely political, rising hostility toward institutional checks, messaging that portrays legal accountability as authoritarianism. This mindset is not unique to one side of the political spectrum. It is a predictable outcome when opaque funding structures merge with crisis-driven politics. But the current scale is unprecedented because the legal exposure is unprecedented. A former president facing multiple criminal cases, multiple civil trials, and ongoing investigations is not a normal scenario. And when that figure is simultaneously running for office, actively fundraising, and mobilizing millions of supporters, the system enters uncharted territory. This intersection where legal peril, political ambition, and hidden financing meet is where the stakes become national rather than personal. Because ultimately the question is not simply who is funding these legal defenses, but rather what is the long-term cost of a political movement whose financial survival depends on framing the justice system as an enemy. That is the question we now face, and the consequences of how it is answered will outlast the current news cycle. As the legal pressures intensify and the financial architecture surrounding them grows more complex, another layer of the story becomes impossible to ignore: the institutional strain that builds when political loyalty, legal vulnerability, and hidden capital intersect for too long. Institutions, like markets, can absorb shocks. They can withstand pressure, adapt to stress, and keep functioning even when conditions around them become turbulent. But no institution, whether a court, a political party, or a fundraising ecosystem, can endure unending tension without paying a price. And that price becomes visible in subtle ways long before it erupts in dramatic ones. You start to see advisors distancing themselves, donors hesitating, strategists recalibrating messaging to account for the legal uncertainty that now shadows everything. These are early warning signs, like hairline fractures in a structure that once felt unshakable. They don't signal collapse, but they signal weight. They signal stress. Inside any political operation, when legal defense becomes the financial priority, every other priority begins to warp around it. Staff who were hired to build a campaign suddenly find their roles shifting. Donor outreach teams must tailor messages not around policy, but around legal urgency. Political strategists must craft narratives that can keep enthusiasm alive, even when much of their candidates' energy is spent in courtrooms rather than on the trail. It isn't that the political machine stops functioning, it's that it changes function. It becomes a dual-purpose entity, part campaign, part shield. And shields require constant reinforcement. The most committed supporters might accept this shift without complaint. Many may even embrace it as a badge of loyalty, seeing the legal battles as proof of persecution. But institutions, political parties, regulatory agencies, legal systems do not respond to faith. They respond to structure. And the structure we're seeing is one where financial opacity intersects with legal vulnerability in a way that strains the system in quiet but accumulating ways. Political parties are particularly sensitive to uncertainty. They plan years ahead, allocating resources based on expectations of stability. But when one of their most influential figures is under perpetual legal fire, those plans become impossible to predict. Candidates down the ballot must decide whether aligning closely with Trump strengthens or threatens their own fundraising. Party committees must weigh how much support to offer without inheriting risk. Even longtime allies must assess whether the legal exposure creates liabilities for their own political futures. And uncertainty, like debt compounds. Meanwhile, the justice system faces pressure of a different kind. It does not move faster or slower based on public sentiment, but it does operate within a public atmosphere increasingly shaped by political narratives. When millions of people are told daily that the courts are corrupt, that prosecutors are acting politically, that judges are weaponized, the system absorbs those perceptions. They do not change rulings, but they change public trust, and trust is the invisible currency of any justice system. Once damaged, it is difficult to repair. This is why the funding structures and the rhetoric built around them matter so much. They do not only finance legal defense, they shape how millions of Americans interpret the legitimacy of legal outcomes. When political fundraising depends on portraying legal accountability as political persecution, it becomes nearly impossible for supporters to accept any ruling that goes against their preferred candidate. The narrative has already framed the outcome before the verdict is even reached. At the same time, the political ecosystem around Trump adapts to his legal reality. Other candidates run their campaigns with less certainty. Media narratives loop endlessly between polling, legal developments, and donor reactions. And the dark money networks operating in the background continue financing legal fights in ways the public cannot fully see, perpetuating the cycle. But the system cannot sustain infinite escalation. At some point, something gives: donor patience, institutional tolerance, public trust, or the internal cohesion of the political movement itself. We've seen this pattern play out in corporate crises, in political scandals, and in financial collapses, a period of slow, quiet strain followed by a moment that forces a reckoning. The question is not whether the current structure can continue. It has, and it likely will for some time. The real question is how long it can continue before the consequences become unavoidable. Legal cases will progress, courts will issue rulings, fees will keep rising, donors will eventually tire or shift focus, hidden capital will reposition itself, and the political machine will have to adapt to realities it cannot fully control. For now, though, the system keeps moving, powered by money, by loyalty, by outrage, and by the increasingly blurred line between campaign financing and legal survival. But each forward step also deepens the structural tension, and tension, once it reaches a critical point, always demands release. Exactly how that release will come or what form it will take is a question no one can answer yet. But the signs of strain are growing sharper, and institutions, even the strongest ones, can only bend so far before they change shape entirely. As everything converges, the money, the messaging, the legal pressure, a final question sits at the center of this entire story: what happens next? Because a system built on urgency, opacity, and constant financial mobilization doesn't simply dissolve when the news cycle moves on. It leaves behind structural consequences, both visible and invisible. One of the most immediate consequences is psychological. Millions of supporters have been conditioned to believe that every courtroom is a battlefield, every judge is an opponent, and every ruling is part of a broader political war. When people internalize that worldview, institutions lose their neutral authority. And when institutions lose authority, public life becomes governed less by shared rules and more by competing narratives. That's not a partisan observation, it's a practical one. No democracy can function for long when half the population views its legal system as illegitimate. Another consequence is financial. The political organizations funding this legal defense are burning through money at a pace unprecedented in modern politics. Legal fees don't fluctuate like campaign spending, they only trend upward. Each case spawns appeals, filings, hearings, investigations, and trial preparation. Costs compound month after month. Eventually, every donor base, no matter how loyal, reaches a point of exhaustion. And when that fatigue sets in, the political machine must either reinvent itself or face a liquidity crisis that exposes how dependent it has become on perpetual outrage. Then there's the strategic consequence. Every hour spent in a courtroom is an hour not spent campaigning, organizing, or governing. Legal survival crowds out every other priority. And while political messaging can transform legal setbacks into rallying cries, it cannot replace the work required to build long-term electoral infrastructure. The more energy poured into defense, the less remains for the future. But the most profound consequence may be cultural. When dark money becomes normalized, when billions can move unseen through political and legal ecosystems, citizens lose visibility into who actually shapes outcomes. Hidden capital always carries hidden influence, and influence without transparency erodes trust faster than any scandal. Yet this moment also creates an opening, a chance for people to recognize the stakes, to understand how deeply financial opacity has intertwined itself with political power, a chance for reform if enough citizens demand it. Because systems don't change on their own. They change when people insist that sunlight matters, that accountability matters, that the rules should protect the public interest, not the private advantage of those who can afford the most sophisticated legal and financial structures. The story unfolding now is more than a political drama. It is a stress test of American governance, of whether institutions can withstand sustained pressure from money, messaging, and mistrust. And the result will shape not only the next election cycle, but the long-term health of the democratic system itself. The question that remains is simple: will citizens settle for a system built in shadows, or will they demand one built in daylight?